You've likely heard the noise surrounding cryptocurrency, the hype, the volatile exchange rates, and confusing jargon. But to understand what's actually happening under the hood, we need to temporarily set aside the thought of computers entirely. Modern finance relies on centralized authorities to function. When you buy a coffee, a bank updates your account and the coffee shop's account, acting as the trusted middleman that verifies who owns what. Now, imagine cutting that middleman out. Suppose you and your friends exchange cash so often that you decide to keep a communal ledger on a public whiteboard instead. No banks, no referees, just a list of debts to be settled at the end of the month. The system has a fatal flaw. Since it's a public board, Bob could easily pick up a marker and write, "Alice pays Bob $100, without Alice ever agreeing to it. Building a functional digital currency requires us to solve a human problem, finding a mathematical substitute for trust. The first tool we need to prevent forgery on our whiteboard is a public key-private key pair. Unlike a handwritten signature, a digital signature is unique to each message. You feed the transaction details and your secret key into a function, which then spits out a specific string of ones and zeros unique to that exact payment. Anyone else can then use your public key to verify that signature. The math outputs a true or false to prove you authorized the transaction, all without ever revealing your secret key to the world. However, Bob could still copy a valid "Alice pays Bob $100" line and paste it a dozen times to drain her account. We stop this by adding a unique ID to every transaction. Because the signature depends on the message, changing the ID forces the math to generate an entirely new string, making blind copying impossible. Once the ledger is secure against forgery, it no longer needs to be tied to physical US dollars. As long as users follow a rule not to spend more than their recorded balance, the ledger itself becomes the money. The physical coin is an illusion. The history of transactions is the actual currency. Hosting this ledger on a single website still requires a central authority. To remove that last bit of trust, we give every user their own independent private copy of the ledger. Now, to make a payment, you sign the transaction and broadcast it out loud for the entire network to hear and record. This creates a synchronization nightmare. Because network speeds vary, different users will hear the same transactions arriving at different times and in conflicting orders. If Bob thinks Alice paid him first, but Charlie's ledger says Alice paid him first, whose list is correct? We need a way for thousands of strangers to agree on a single timeline without a master referee to organize them. Solving this specific coordination problem is the breakthrough that makes cryptocurrencies possible. The solution relies on a cryptographic tool called a hash function, specifically SA256. Think of this as an irreversible digital meat grinder. You can drop any data into it, and it returns a fixed string of bits that looks completely random. To add a block of transactions to the ledger, the network requires users to rapidly guess random numbers until the hash of the block starts with a specific long string of zeros. Because the output is unpredictable, finding that string requires an astronomical amount of blind guessing. Finding the right hash proves massive computational effort was spent. We chain these blocks together by including the previous block's hash in the new one. If you try to alter an old transaction, it changes that block's hash, which breaks the chain and forces you to redo the computational work for every block that follows. This establishes a universal rule for the network: always trust the longest chain, as it represents the version of history with the most work behind it. This proof of work forces a decentralized network to agree, making fraud mathematically infeasible unless an attacker controls more computing power than the rest of the globe combined. This brings us to miners, the network auditors who race to solve these hash puzzles and seal new blocks into the history. To incentivize this work, the network rewards whoever solves the block with newly generated currency and transaction fees from the users. Compared to swiping a credit card, which a central bank can process in an instant, this mathematically intensive validation is much slower. But that deliberate friction is the point. A decentralized, cryptographically secured chain of blocks is all Bitcoin actually is. You don't need to understand the complex math to use a digital currency. However, knowing how this trustless architecture operates protects you from the hype and reveals the true mechanics of our digital